The luxurious private yacht sliced through the turquoise waters, its engines a low, throaty purr that echoed Julian Hargrove's sense of entitlement. At 36, Julian commanded attention effortlessly, his tailored linen shirt clinging to the broad lines of his shoulders, the salt-kissed breeze ruffling his dark blonde hair. Ahead, the island sprawled like a jewel in the sea beaches gleaming under the relentless sun, pristine sands merging into vibrant reefs. It was paradise, or rather, the curated version designed for men like him, wealthy, untouchable, and increasingly bored. Adjusting his sunglasses, he muttered, "Another playground for the elite." How original, his sarcasm masking a deeper restlessness that gnawed at him. The symphony of power plays and extravagant parties back home left him hollow, and with his wedding to Eliza looming, that hollowness felt like a chasm. As the yacht docked, Julian thought briefly of the engagement ring sitting in his penthouse safe. Eliza was perfect, poised, privileged, compliant, but the idea of marrying her felt like slipping into a tailored suit that no longer fit. This trip was meant to be a distraction, one final taste of freedom before the inevitable. His friends were already disembarking, their laughter raucous against the serene backdrop. Marcus, always grinning. Derek, the loudmouth broker. And a few others, all products of the same privileged mold. "Jules, this place is a gold mine," Marcus shouted. "Think we'll find some entertainment?" Julian chuckled dryly. "Oh, I'm sure it's all very authentic," he replied, sarcasm coating his words. They piled into a luxury SUV, and through the tinted windows, Julian glimpsed the island's raw beauty, swaying palms, distant drums, a pulse of something real, stirring something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The resort, perched high on the cliffs, was a masterpiece of opulence, blending modern luxury with tropical grandeur. Julian checked in smoothly, his smile disarming the receptionist, while his friend's crude jokes echoed behind him. Once in his suite, Julian dropped his bag and stepped onto the balcony. Below, the ocean stretched endlessly, wild and hypnotic, the scent of salt and frangipani heavy in the air. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to simply be, and the island's wildness touched something deep inside him, something the sterile world of mergers and parties never could. As the sun began to sink, his thoughts turned again to Eliza, efficient, calculating, perfect. Their union had always been more alliance than love, a merger disguised as a marriage. Standing there, with the ocean whispering secrets below, he wondered if he had ever truly chosen anything in his life. Faint music drifted up from the beach drums and flutes, weaving a melody older than any empire he knew. He strained to hear it, drawn by its raw, unpolished beauty. "Enough of this," he muttered, shaking off the introspection. He pulled on a fresh shirt and decided to explore not the polished bars or curated luxuries, but the heartbeat of the island itself. The sand was cool beneath his feet as he followed the winding path down to the beach. The waves crashed against the shore, steady and alive, a rhythm that stirred something restless within him. For the first time in years, Julian wasn't looking to escape. He was looking for something real, and he had no idea that the island had already set its own plans in motion. The festival sprawled across a sandy clearing near the beach, alive with color and movement. Vendors hawked handmade jewelry and fresh seafood under flickering torchlight, while performers in vibrant costumes weaved through the crowd, their bodies undulating to the rhythm of ancient dances. Banners flapped in the warm breeze, emblazoned with messages about marine conservation, reminders of the fragile coral reefs that fringed the island like a jeweled crown. Julian's friends, a boisterous trio of affluent playboys, trailed behind him, their laughter loud and unrestrained, fueled by the rum they'd been sipping since noon. "Come on, Jules, this is your bachelor bash. Let's find some real entertainment," one of them, a stocky financier named Derek, called out, his voice dripping with crude humor. Julian waved them off with a sardonic grin, his eyes scanning the scene with a mix of curiosity and disdain. He'd come here seeking a fleeting thrill, a temporary escape from the gilded cage of his impending marriage to Eliza, a woman as polished and predictable as the diamond on her finger. But as he pushed through the throng, the air thick with the scent of salt and blooming frangipani, he felt an unexpected pull toward the authenticity unfolding before him. It was intoxicating, this unfiltered pulse of life, so different from the orchestrated galas of his world. That's when he saw her. Standing at the edge of a makeshift stage, a woman with sun-kissed skin and eyes like the deep sea commanded the attention of a small crowd. She was mid-speech, her voice cutting through the evening air with a passion that was both fierce and melodic, laced with the subtle inflections of her island heritage. Marisol, as he would later learn, was a force of nature 30 years old, with the grace of a dancer and the resolve of a warrior. Her dark hair cascaded in waves over her shoulders, and her simple sundress clung to her curves in a way that spoke of effortless sensuality, not the calculated allure of high fashion. These reefs aren't just rocks and water, she was saying, her words sharp and alive, gesturing toward a display of preserved coral fragments. They're the lifeblood of our community, the cradle for fish that feed our families. If we don't protect them now, we're dooming future generations to a barren sea, the crowd murmured in agreement, drawn to her magnetic presence. Julian lingered at the periphery, his arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his mouth. How quaint, he thought, this earnest plea for a cause that wouldn't even register in his boardrooms back home. Still, there was something about the way she moved, the fire in her eyes, that made his pulse quicken. It was as if the ocean itself had taken human form, wild and untamed. Unable to resist, he stepped closer, his voice laced with that confident sarcasm that had always served him well in negotiations. Impressive speech, he drawled, loud enough for her to hear over the music. But isn't it a bit simplistic? I mean, out here on this little island, preaching to the converted. Back in the real world, it's all about progress, development, investment. You can't stop the tide with words alone. The crowd parted slightly, and Marisol's gaze locked onto his, her expression a blend of surprise and irritation. She sized him up in an instant, taking in his expensive clothes and the air of entitlement that clung to him like cologne. And you must be one of those real-world experts, she shot back, her tone direct and unflinching, infused with a rhythmic lilt that made her words feel like a dance. Let me guess, here on vacation, thinking you can drop in and lecture us on what we already know. We've been living with these tides long before your fancy resorts showed up. Progress? That's just a pretty word for destruction if it means poisoning our waters for profit. Julian felt a jolt of something electric, a mix of annoyance and intrigue. No one talked to him like that, least of all a woman whose world was so far removed from his. But there was an undeniable allure in her defiance, the way her eyes sparked with unyielding fire. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a teasing murmur. Touché. But come on, isn't there room for a little fun amidst all this seriousness? This island's got more to offer than just lectures on fish. Her brother, a sturdy man in his early 30s with the same strong jawline and watchful eyes, appeared at her side then, his presence a subtle but clear warning. He didn't say a word, just folded his arms and fixed Julian with a steady, protective stare, as if assessing a potential threat. Julian noted the resemblance, the familial bond evident in the way the man hovered just close enough to intervene. It stirred a faint twinge of jealousy in him, something unfamiliar, a reminder of the superficial connections in his own life. Marisol, undeterred, stepped forward, her voice steady and laced with wit. Fun? Is that what you call it? disrespecting our traditions, turning our home into your playground?" She gestured toward his friends, who had caught up and were now snickering in the background, their crude comments floating over like unwelcome echoes. "Your buddies there seem to think so. But let me make this clear, I'm not here for your amusement. If you want to learn something real, stick around. Otherwise, take your fun back to wherever you came from." Julian's friends, ever the instigators, chose that moment to amplify the tension. Derek elbowed him with a grin, his voice loud and mocking. "Ooh, looks like you've got a feisty one, Jules. What's the matter? Not used to a woman who doesn't fall at your feet?" Another friend, a lanky lawyer named Brett, chimed in with a sharp laugh. "Yeah, man, lay off the philosophy and just buy her a drink. Trust me, by morning, she'll be waking up in your bed. They always do when the price is right." Matteo, Marisol's brother, tensed, taking a sharp step toward Brett, fists clenched. But before he could move further, Marisol placed a firm hand against his chest, calm, deliberate, enough to stop him cold. Without a word, Matteo held his ground, his glare burning through Brett. Their boorish encouragement only widened the gap between Julian and Marisol, highlighting the excess that defined his circle. He felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck, not just at their words, but at the way Marisol's expression hardened, her independence shining through like a beacon. Through his eyes, the scene unfolded with a sensual intensity, the golden light of the torches casting shadows that danced across her skin, the rhythmic beat of the drums syncing with his quickening heartbeat. He could smell the salt on her, mixed with the faint sweetness of tropical flowers, and it stirred a physical awareness that was both thrilling and unsettling. His body reacted instinctively, a warmth pooling in his core, but he pushed it down, masking it with another sarcastic quip. "My friends have a point. Maybe you're overthinking it. Life's too short for all this doom and gloom." Marisol's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something deeper beneath her anger, perhaps her recognition of the loneliness in his bravado. Overthinking. That's rich coming from someone who probably thinks the ocean is just a backdrop for his selfies. If you cared to look beyond your privilege, you'd see it's our lifeblood. But go ahead, keep playing the arrogant tourist. See how far that gets you. The exchange lingered in the air, charged with unspoken tension. Julian's mind raced, his internal monologue a whirlwind of conflict. Part of him wanted to walk away, to dismiss her as just another idealistic local, but another part, the part that had been whispering discontent since his arrival, yearned to understand her fire, to feel the authenticity she embodied. It was a dangerous pull, one that threatened the carefully constructed facade of his life. As the music swelled and the dancers resumed their hypnotic sway, Marisol turned away, rejoining the crowd with a grace that left him momentarily speechless. Her brother shot him a final, suspicious glance before following her, his protective stance a clear signal that Julian was not welcome in their world just yet. Julian's friends pulled him back into their orbit, dragging him toward a row of food stalls with more laughter and crude jokes, but his thoughts remained tethered to her. By the time the festival lights began to fade into the night, Julian found himself lingering on the outskirts, watching as Marisol helped pack up the displays. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and in that moment, he felt a flicker of genuine interest ignite within him, a spark that went beyond mere attraction. It was the beginning of something profound, a challenge to his self-centered existence that he couldn't ignore. As he turned to leave, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore echoed in his ears, a sensual reminder of the emotional tides pulling him under. Little did he know, this was only the start of the storm. As the festival lights dimmed and the last notes of island music faded into the night, Julian left with his friends in a haze of laughter and sarcasm, brushing off the lingering sparks of the evening. The next day drifted by in a haze of overindulgence, with Julian and his friends sprawling around the resort's infinity pool, sipping rum, blasting music, and letting the tropical sun strip away whatever sense of responsibility they had left. The humid night wrapped the island in a thick, intoxicating haze as the resort's open-air lounge came alive with the thrumming pulse of drums. Lanterns swung lazily from palm trees, casting golden halos of light across the packed crowd. Julian adjusted his glasses, a rare sight, even among his friends, who had wasted no time in heckling him for the change. "What's with the specs, Jules?" Marcus had slurred, clapping him on the back hard enough to jostle his drink. "Trying to look all intellectual for the locals?" Julian smirked but said nothing. The truth that he'd lost his lenses earlier while roughhousing near the surf wasn't worth explaining. Besides, he welcomed the barrier the glasses provided. They made it easier to hide the way his gaze kept straying, unbidden and unwilling, toward the stage. The music shifted, a sultry rhythm rising as a troupe of island dancers took their places under the lanterns. But it was Marisol who commanded the crowd's attention the moment she stepped forward, and Julian's breath hitched in his throat before he could stop it. She wore a shimmering costume that clung to her lithe frame, a fiery two-piece ensemble adorned with beads and shells that caught the light with every slow, hypnotic movement. Her sun-kissed skin gleamed under the torches, her long hair cascading over her shoulders like a dark river. The jeweled fabric of her skirt swayed low on her hips, emphasizing the fluid, sensual power of her dance. Julian couldn't tear his eyes away. Through the crisp clarity of his glasses, every motion was sharpened to perfection, precise. Roll of her hips, the defiant tilt of her chin, the fierce spark that ignited in her sea-green eyes when she spun. It didn't take long for his friends to catch on. "Damn, look at her go," Derek muttered, elbowing Marcus. "Wild little thing. Bet she'd be a hell of a ride. You think the good doctor here is taking notes?" Marcus jeered, nudging Julian pointedly. "Hey, Jules, maybe you can impress her with a lecture on coral reefs." Laughter erupted, but Julian barely heard it. His focus was locked on Marisol, on the way she moved as if the ocean itself had taught her to dance. He should have laughed along, should have thrown back some snarky remark and reclaimed his usual place above it all. Instead, he stayed silent, the glass of rum in his hand sweating against his palm. The performance drew to a close amid wild applause. Marisol bowed low, her hair spilling over one shoulder, and began weaving her way through the tables with the other dancers, offering thanks, smiles, fleeting touches. That's when Derek, emboldened by rum and bad judgment, called out, "Hey, sweetheart, you dance like a dream. How about showing us a private encore?" Julian stiffened. He caught the flash of anger that crossed Marisol's face, the way her body tensed mid-step. Instinct warred with pride. He should shut Derek up, should say something, but instead, he moved, trying to intercept her before the moment exploded into full disaster. "Marisol, please wait." He reached out without thinking, just needing to stop her, to fix the mess spiraling around him. Marisol turned on him sharply, her eyes flashing with a fury that stole his breath, and before he could say another word, her palm cracked hard across his face. The sharp crack of palm against cheek echoed over the sudden hush. Julian froze, blinking behind his glasses as Marisol yanked her arm free, her eyes blazing. "Don't you ever touch me like I'm one of your toys," she hissed, her voice low and furious. Then she was gone, vanishing into the crowd before Julian could summon a single word in response. The silence fractured, and his friends howled with laughter. "Oh man, Jules, she clocked you good. Guess the specs don't make you as charming as you thought." Julian forced a smirk, but it felt brittle, hollow. His cheek burned where her hand had landed, but worse was the slow, seeping anger at Derek, at himself, at the damned electricity that still thrummed in his veins despite her rejection. He lasted 15 minutes among the revelry before slipping away, muttering some excuse about getting another drink. In truth, he wandered the resort's winding paths aimlessly, driven by a restless pull he refused to name. He found her near one of the small bungalows tucked away behind the main lodge. Through the dappled moonlight, he saw Marisol kneeling beside a little boy no more than 5 or 6 who clung to her neck as if she were the only anchor in the world. Julian ducked behind a column of flowering vines, heart-hammering. The boy's mother stood nearby, tears streaking her weathered face. "Thank you, Marisol," she said, her voice cracking. "Without you, we could never afford the treatments." Marisol brushed the child's hair back tenderly, her voice low but fierce. "He deserves every chance. All of them do. That's why I dance, Mrs. Ortiz. It's not just for show." Julian felt the words like a blow to the chest. Not for tourists. Not for ego. For the island's children. He stepped back, retreating silently into the shadows before she could spot him. The bitter taste of shame rose in his throat. Back at the bar, he would have laughed about getting slapped, brushed it off with a crude joke. But now he lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling fan slicing slow circles through the darkness, replaying every moment, the defiance in Marisol's eyes, the sting of her hand, the fierce tenderness she showed a broken child. He wasn't that kind of man, the type to get tangled up in a woman. Least of all a woman like her. He'd come to the island for a last taste of freedom, not to lose himself in something he couldn't control. And yet, even as he cursed himself, even as he promised that by morning he'd forget her, he knew he was lying. This wasn't supposed to happen. Women like her, proud, untamed, devastatingly real, were dangerous. Not because they trapped you, but because they made you want to leap without looking. And Julian Hargrove didn't leap. He calculated, he conquered, he moved on. He turned over in bed, flinging an arm over his face to block out the moonlight creeping through the shutters. "This is just a moment," he muttered under his breath, almost pleading with himself. "It'll pass. It always does." But deep down, he knew Marisol had already left her mark, carved beneath the polished surface he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. And no amount of sarcasm or swagger could undo it now. The sun dipped low over the turquoise waters as Julian raced his jet ski alongside his friends, their laughter sharp against the ocean's pulse. The salty spray cooled his skin, but his mind wasn't on the waves. It was still tangled in the fire of the night before Marisol's defiant gaze, her cutting words. He had brushed it off then, but now, as the engine roared beneath him, an unfamiliar gnawing stirred inside. Curiosity. Regret. Something he didn't want to name. "Lighten up, Julian," shouted Marcus, one of his oldest companions, his voice slurred from the morning's cocktails. The group, affluent men in their 30s and 40s, clad in designer swimwear and sunglasses that screamed excess, zoomed around the bay. Their jet skis carving white foam paths through the water. They were all here for Julian's pre-wedding bash, a final hurrah before he tied the knot with Eliza, the socialite his family had practically arranged for him. But as the wind whipped against his face, Julian couldn't shake the image of Marisol, her lithe form moving with the grace of the waves, her words a sharp rebuke to his sarcasm. It was during one of their wild loops that he spotted her on the shore. Marisol stood ankle-deep in the shallows, her brother Mateo at her side, both focused on a group of children clustered around them. She wore a simple sundress that clung to her curves in the breeze, her dark hair tied back as she pointed out something glinting beneath the water. Julian's grip tightened on the handlebars, a flare of irrational jealousy burning in his chest. Matteo's casual closeness, the easy way he stood with her, it grated more than it should have. Julian knew it was absurd. Marisol had made it clear she wanted nothing from him. And yet, watching her rooted in something real, something honest, made his own life feel hollow by comparison. "Look at you, Jules, staring off like a lovesick puppy," Derek called, his voice dripping with crude humor. "That island girl got your engine revving." The group erupted into raucous laughter, their taunts riding the breeze. Julian forced a smirk, playing along, but inside, irritation simmered. He accelerated sharply across the bay, trying to outrun the gnawing discomfort coiling tighter in his gut. This trip was supposed to be an escape, a last reckless taste of freedom, but here, under the island sun, his carefully built facade was beginning to crack. Julian peeled away from the group, the roar of his jet ski merging with the rush of the wind in his ears. He needed space from the noise, from the endless jokes, from the gnawing pull he refused to name. He pushed the throttle harder, the machine vibrating beneath him as he carved across the open water. For a moment, it was freedom pure and blinding. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered. A jolt rocked through the jet ski. Julian barely had time to curse before the machine seized, veering sharply toward the jagged rocks jutting just beneath the surface. There was a sickening impact, a flash of blinding pain, and then he was airborne, weightless, crashing into the unforgiving water. The ocean swallowed him whole. Underwater, disoriented and gasping, Julian's world blurred. Salt scorched his eyes. The crash echoed in his skull. He kicked weakly, but the current dragged him deeper, twisting him in its grip. Somewhere in the haze, a shape broke through dark hair, a flash of pale skin, a mask glinting under the fractured light. Marisol. His mind clung to the vision, her hair fanning out like a halo, her turquoise eyes locking onto his, fierce and determined. Then everything went black when Julian surfaced, sputtering and half-conscious. It was to the taste of salt and the faint pressure of lips against his. Through the blurred confusion, he saw her straddling the rocks, wetsuit clinging to her, hair plastered to her forehead, her mouth sealing over his in a desperate, rhythmic push of breath into his lungs. Her hands gripped his shoulders with steady strength, anchoring him to life. Julian coughed violently, the world snapping into painful clarity. Marisol pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her own wild with fear and fury. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice hoarse but steady. Behind her, Matteo and a couple of the others were rushing toward them, but Julian barely registered anything beyond the girl in front of him, the girl who had just dragged him from the edge, who tasted of salt and sunlight and something far more dangerous, something he wasn't sure he could ever escape now. The locals had started to gather by the time Marisol finished checking Julian over. Kneeling beside him on the sand, her wetsuit dripping, she ran her hands quickly over his arms, chest, ribs searching for fractures, bleeding, signs of internal injury. Her touch was efficient, professional. But for Julian, barely conscious of anything beyond the rhythmic crash of the waves and the sharp sting of salt in his eyes, there was nothing clinical about it. All he could feel was the pressure of her palms on his skin, the brush of her body against his ass. She leaned closer, her damp hair clinging to her face. No broken bones, no gashes. Just a badly twisted ankle and bruises blooming under his skin. "You're lucky," Marisol muttered, her voice rough from exertion as she sat back on her heels. "Stupid. But lucky." Julian tried to speak, to thank her, but his mouth felt dry, heavy. Before he could form the words, Marisol was already waving over the resort's emergency team, signaling for the small beach ambulance that had just pulled up with flashing lights. Without ceremony, she helped lift him onto the stretcher, barking instructions at the attendants. She didn't wait for gratitude. She didn't even look back. Julian was half dazed as they loaded him onto the cart, his friends crowding around with drunken concern. Through the haze, he watched Marisol stride away, peeling off her mask, her figure cutting a determined path through the gathering crowd. She didn't glance back once. Later that evening, Julian lay sprawled across the crisp sheets of his resort bed, his ankle bound tightly in a compression bandage, the dull throb of bruises spreading like a slow burn through his limbs. Outside the open balcony doors, laughter floated up from the bar below, too loud, too careless, a sharp contrast to the gnawing disquiet turning in his gut. His friends had stopped by briefly before descending into their evening's entertainment, their departure marked by the usual flurry of teasing remarks and mock sympathy. "Try not to dream about your mermaid tonight," Jules, Derek had called out, flashing a wide grin as he tossed a beach towel over his shoulder. "Yeah," Marcus had chimed in, laughter lacing his voice. "She saved your life, man. You owe her at least dinner. Or, knowing you, a full week of groveling." The others had chuckled, rough and careless, clapping him on the back with a familiarity that felt strangely hollow in the thick, stifling air of the room. Then, with the slap of flip-flops against tile, and a few parting jokes shouted over shoulders. They had gone, leaving Julian alone in the fading twilight, the room heavy with silence and salt. He should have been relieved. He wasn't. The ache in his body was secondary to the restless pull in his chest, an itch he couldn't scratch. He closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids wasn't empty. It was filled with her, Marisol, the way she had moved through the water without hesitation. The fierce set of her jaw as she breathed life back into him, the quiet fire in her touch as she checked him over 4 injuries, all professionalism and none of the pity he would have expected. Pushing himself upright with a grunt, Julian swung his legs over the edge of the bed, grabbed the crutches leaning against the nightstand, and stood. The throbbing in his ankle flared, but he barely registered it. His mind was already elsewhere. Drawn to her as inevitably as the tide pulled at the shore, without allowing himself the space to second-guess it, he moved toward the door, chasing a gravity he no longer had the strength or the will to resist. The night air was warm, carrying the scent of salt and distant blossoms, as Julian navigated the narrow stone path leading to the cluster of staff bungalows tucked behind the main resort grounds. Each step sent a dull protest through his injured ankle, but he barely registered the pain. His mind was too full, buzzing with the lingering imprint of her hands on his skin, the memory of her breath in his lungs. Marisol's bungalow was small, unassuming, half shadowed beneath the wide leaves of a sprawling palm. A dim porch light burned above the door, casting soft pools of gold across the weathered steps. Through the thin mesh of the screen door, he caught a glimpse of her curled into an armchair, legs tucked beneath her, a heavy book balanced on her knees, her damp hair pulled into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. For a moment, Julian hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe a curt dismissal, maybe an indifference that would mirror the walls he'd spent years perfecting around himself, but the pull toward her was stronger than pride, stronger than reason. He lifted a hand and knocked, 2 soft raps that sounded almost apologetic in the heavy, humid stillness. Marisol looked up, startled, her eyes narrowing as she recognized him. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she set the book aside and crossed the small space. Unlatching the door, but not stepping aside to invite him in. "You shouldn't be walking on that ankle," she said, her voice even, carrying no particular warmth, but no sharpness either. Julian managed a half smile, leaning awkwardly on his crutch. "I had a more compelling reason to come find you than to rest," he said, his tone softer than he intended, almost careful. She studied him, that same unreadable expression she wore so easily flickering across her face. Before she stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her with a quiet click. For a moment, they simply stood there, suspended between choices, the night wrapped around them like a thick velvet curtain. Julian exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling the raw edges of his own vulnerability. I didn't get to say thank you. For today. For everything. Marisol crossed her arms loosely over her chest, the hem of her simple tank top fluttering slightly in the breeze. You already thanked me, she said, a faint tilt to her mouth that wasn't quite a smile. Every breath you're still taking is thanks enough. Julian laughed under his breath, the sound low and a little rough. Still, he said, I thought maybe I could buy you a drink. Repay the favor, even if it's just with terrible conversation and cheap beer. He watched her carefully, the offer hanging between them, fragile and strangely heavy. Marisol tilted her head, regarding him with an unreadable flicker in her gaze, as if weighing whether the risk of his presence was worth the inconvenience. Finally, she reached behind her to grab a thin jacket from the back of a porch chair. Shrugging it over her shoulders, there's a place down the beach, she said. If you can keep up. She didn't wait for his agreement, just started down the sandy path with an easy, unhurried stride that made no allowance for his injury, and Julian, with a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, adjusted the crutch under his arm and followed her into the night, drawn as surely as the tide chased the moon, knowing even then that he was already in far deeper waters than he'd ever intended. The small beach bar was little more than a scattering of worn wooden posts strung with swaying paper lanterns, the soft thrum of the ocean providing a rhythm steadier than any music. They sat on low cushions half buried in the warm sand, the night folding around them like a protective shroud. The salty air was thick with the scent of seaweed and driftwood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, laughter floated up from a bonfire Julian couldn't see. Marisol leaned back against a weathered pole, her legs drawn loosely beneath her, a bottle of beer cradled in her hand. She looked at ease here, grounded, unshaken by the shifting world around her. Julian shifted carefully on his cushion, stretching his bad ankle forward with a grimace, before glancing over at her through the dim glow of the lanterns. So, he said, voice rough from salt and exhaustion, you saved my life. I figure the least I can do is find out who I owe it to. Marisol huffed a soft breath that might have been a laugh, her gaze steady. I'm Marisol Reyes. I'm a marine biologist. I studied in the U.S. for a while, Miami mostly. But I always knew I'd come back here. She tilted her head slightly, eyes drifting out toward the dark line of the horizon. This island. It's not just where I grew up. It's part of who I am. My family's been here for generations. We're the ones who preserve the traditions, the stories, the old ways. We're responsible for keeping them alive, passing them down. Her voice carried no grandiosity, only a quiet pride, a certainty that made Julian's chest tighten in ways he didn't fully understand. I thought about staying in the States, she continued. There were opportunities, jobs, money, but none of it mattered compared to this. She spread her hand absently, as if encompassing the whole of the island, the water, the lives interwoven with the tides. Julian watched her, feeling the simple truth of her words settle somewhere deep inside him, heavier than he expected. So, Mr. Show-Off, she said, the corners of her mouth twitching with barely suppressed humor. Besides breaking expensive toys and charming resort staff, what is it exactly that you do? Julian leaned back on his elbows, pretending a casualness he didn't entirely feel, the soft sand shifting under his palms. I run a company, he said, lifting a shoulder in a mock shrug. Chemicals, mostly. Manufacturing, distribution. Very glamorous if you're into plastics and industrial solvents. He watched her carefully for her reaction, already anticipating the subtle tightening of her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes. It came, right on cue, not anger exactly, but a quiet withdrawal, a slipping away behind the careful walls she wore like armor. "And let me guess," she said after a beat, her voice deceptively light. "You came here for a little break before returning to the important work of making the world just a little more toxic." Julian laughed under his breath, the sound low and self-deprecating. "Something like that," he admitted. "Although, to be fair, I wasn't exactly planning to drown myself as part of the company mission statement." Marisol shook her head, the ghost of a smile playing around her mouth despite herself. "You make it sound so noble," she said. There was no real venom in her voice, only a wryness. A weariness that spoke of long battles fought against things too big to change. Julian sat up straighter, the humor bleeding out of him, as he met her gaze across the dim space between them. Julian just watched her, feeling something tighten low in his chest, something complicated and unfamiliar, a strange cocktail of admiration, guilt, and a hunger that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with truly wanting to be seen by someone like her. He cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly on the cushion. "Sounds like you're doing something that actually matters," he said. And this time, there was no sarcasm, no mask, just the raw truth of it. Marisol studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity in his voice against the instincts that told her to be wary. Whatever she saw, it softened her, just a little. "Maybe," she said, rising smoothly to her feet and brushing the sand from her legs. "Or maybe I'm just stubborn." She extended a hand toward him, a slight smirk tugging at her lips. "Come on, city boy. Let's see if you can make it back without another rescue." Julian huffed a low laugh, ignoring the jolt of pain in his ankle as he reached up and let her pull him upright. For a brief, fleeting moment, their hands lingered together, warm, solid. Reluctant to part before common sense intervened, and they let go. They began to walk slowly down the moonlit beach, side by side, the weight of the conversation settling between them like the first stirrings of a tide too strong to fight. They moved slowly along the curve of the beach, the soft crush of their footsteps barely audible beneath the steady murmur of the ocean. Marisol's hair caught the breeze, a few loose strands dancing across her cheek, and Julian found himself watching the way the moonlight kissed the curve of her jaw, the way her bare feet barely left a trace in the sand. He should have been paying more attention to the uneven ground. His foot sank deeper into a soft patch, the sudden shift sending a sharp jolt up his leg. He stumbled, a curse catching low in his throat, but before he could fall, Marisol's hands were there, quick and sure, grabbing his forearm and bracing against his side to steady him. The contact was immediate, electric. Their bodies collided with a soft thud, her warmth pressing into him through the thin layers of their clothes. His hands instinctively came up, one finding the small of her back, the other brushing the curve of her shoulder. They froze for a moment. The world narrowed to the heat between them, the crash of the waves fading into a distant, meaningless roar. Julian's hand, almost of its own volition, slid up to trace the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing lightly against her cheekbone. Marisol's breath caught. He felt it more than heard it, and for a heartbeat, maybe two, she didn't move away, her eyes, wide and luminous in the low light, locked onto his with a vulnerability so raw it made Julian's chest ache. He leaned in, the distance between them evaporating, the magnetic pull undeniable. He was close enough to feel the warmth of her breath against his mouth, when a sharp voice shattered the moment, slicing through the heavy air like a blade. "Marisol." They broke apart as if slapped. Julian turned, heart hammering, to see Matteo striding toward them, his posture rigid, his face set in a scowl that left no room for interpretation. "What are you doing?" Matteo demanded, his words sharp, slicing the humid air between them. His gaze flicked from Marisol to Julian and back again, hard and accusing. "You know better than this," he said, his voice lowering but losing none of its edge. "We don't fraternize with resort guests. That's not who we are." Marisol opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Matteo stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers, his voice dropping into something quieter, heavier. "He's not one of us, Marisol. Don't forget that." The words hung between them, heavy and final, like a door slamming shut without waiting for a reply. Matteo turned and began walking back toward the village, his shoulders tense, his fists clenched at his sides. Marisol hesitated for half a heartbeat longer, her gaze flickering between Julian and the path her brother had taken, conflict warring visibly across her face. Then, with a soft, barely audible exhale, she turned and followed, her figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Julian stood alone on the beach, the salt air cool against his skin, the lingering heat of her touch fading by degrees. He watched her go, something hollow blooming in his chest. For the first time, he realized it wasn't just the island that was foreign to him. It was her world, her roots, her loyalty, her fierce belonging, a world he had no right to claim. And yet, standing there under the indifferent stars, he knew with a painful certainty, he wasn't ready to walk away from it either. The morning sun spilled lazily across the open-air terrace, where Julian and his friends sat around a heavy wooden table, half-eaten plates of tropical fruit and rich pastries scattered between them. Julian stirred the coffee in front of him without drinking it, his mind drifting, distant from the easy laughter bubbling around the table. His ankle throbbed dully under the table, a slow, stubborn reminder of the chaos he'd caused, and yet it was nothing compared to the quiet turmoil churning somewhere deeper, somewhere he couldn't quite reach. Derek, lounging back in his chair with his sunglasses perched low on his nose, nudged Julian's arm with a smirk. "So," he drawled, his voice pitched loud enough to cut through the morning haze, "how was it, Romeo? You and that island girl. Did she show you some of that exotic hospitality?" The table erupted in chuckles, Marcus shaking his head with a tight smile, the others elbowing each other with the mindless cruelty of men who had never learned to sit comfortably in silence. Julian's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "Come on, man," Derek persisted, laughing. "Don't leave us hanging. You looked ready to devour her last night. Gotta admit you work fast." Something inside Julian snapped, quiet but sharp. He set the cup down with a soft clink that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "Shut the hell up, Derek," he said, his voice low and cutting through the lazy atmosphere like a blade. "You don't know what the hell you're talking about." The laughter died abruptly. The only sound left was the distant crash of waves and the slow scrape of a chair leg shifting against the tile. Derek blinked behind his glasses, caught off guard, but covered it with a shrug, lifting his hands as if to say no harm meant. "Whoa, easy there," he said, trying for humor, but landing somewhere closer to uneasy. "Just asking, man. No need to get all sentimental." Julian didn't answer. He just leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the terrace. Marcus watched him for a long moment, his usual lazy grin fading into something more serious. He leaned in, dropping his voice so only Julian could hear. "I know you, man," he said quietly. "I've known you too long not to see it." Julian didn't look at him, but Marcus pressed on, his tone almost grim. "You're not acting like yourself. You're different." There was no accusation in his voice, only concern, heavy and real. "You can't do this," Marcus said, softer now. "You're getting married in 3 weeks. Eliza's waiting back home. This, whatever this is, it's a fantasy. Island air, palm trees. It'll pass." Julian closed his eyes for a beat, the words scraping raw against something inside him. He wanted to argue, wanted to say that it wasn't just the island, or the salt air, or the way Marisol moved like she belonged to a world he could never touch. It was her. It was something real, something that made everything else in his life feel paper-thin and hollow. But he said nothing, because the truth sat too heavy in his chest. too tangled to speak aloud. When he finally opened his eyes again, Marcus had leaned back, giving him space, but watching him with that same steady, knowing gaze. Julian pushed his chair back with a scrape, tossing a few bills onto the table. "I've got somewhere to be," he said, the words clipped final. He didn't wait for their reactions, didn't look back as he limped across the terrace and disappeared down the winding path toward the front of the resort, the hot sun pressing down on his back, the taste of salt and something dangerously close to regret thick on his tongue. Julian scanned the terrace and poolside, but there was no sign of her. A restless tension pulling at him, he made his way to the front desk, where a young woman behind the counter offered a polished smile. "I'm looking for one of your staff," he said, leaning in. Marisol Reyes. The tuk-tuk rattled down the uneven road, weaving through market stalls and colorful houses until it skidded to a stop in a dusty square. Julian paid the driver without waiting for change and followed the directions he'd been given, his steps quick despite the dull ache in his ankle. The village buzzed with life. Children darted between shops. The scent of frying dough hung in the air, but Julian barely noticed. His mind was locked onto a single image, Marisol. At the end of a shaded lane, he spotted the blue gate, Casa Azul. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The noise outside faded instantly, replaced by a softer hum, the murmur of children's voices, the scrape of crayons on paper, the occasional bright peal of laughter. And there she was. Marisol sat cross-legged on a low platform, a battered storybook open on her lap. A small crowd of children gathered around her, hanging on every word. Her hair was tied in a loose braid over one shoulder, and she wore a simple cotton dress, sun-bleached and threadbare at the seams. Julian thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. He stayed at the doorway unseen, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his heart thudding with a hollow, aching rhythm. Marisol's face lit up as she read, her hands moving animatedly, drawing laughter from the children clustered against her sides. One little girl clung to her arm. Another leaned against her hip, eyes wide with wonder. Watching her, Julian realized that whatever life waited for him beyond this island, the boardrooms, the promises, the carefully arranged future, none of it would ever be enough without her. If sensing the weight of his gaze. Marisol looked up and froze when she saw him. For a second, surprise flickered across her face. Then something softer, something tentative, bloomed in her expression, a smile just beginning to form before she glanced quickly back at the children. Julian shifted his weight awkwardly, feeling like an intruder, and, yet unwilling to leave, Marisol gently closed the book and handed it to one of the older boys, whispering something that made the whole group scatter into delighted chaos. She stood and made her way toward him, brushing sand from her dress, her smile uncertain but real. "You found me," she said, stopping a few feet away, her hands twisting loosely in front of her. Julian allowed himself a small, lopsided grin. "Wasn't going to let you get away that easily." Her laugh was soft, almost shy. "Come on," she said, tilting her head toward a small kitchen area. "We're about to serve lunch. You can help if you think you're up for it." Julian chuckled under his breath, following her across the yard, the sun beating down on his shoulders, the weight in his chest strangely lighter now. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt almost like he belonged somewhere, and it had nothing to do with boardrooms or bloodlines or expectations. The kitchen buzzed with soft chatter and the scent of warm bread. Marisol handed Julian a ladle and a stack of bowls, a teasing light in her eyes. "Think you can handle this, city boy?" she said. Julian smirked. "I run a multi-billion-dollar corporation. How hard can soup be?" Minutes later, broth splashed across his shirt. A bowl nearly slipped from his hands, and the children around him giggled uncontrollably. Marisol laughed, stepping in close to steady his hand. "You're holding it wrong," she said, guiding his grip with a gentle touch. "You're a natural," Marisol teased, dabbing the soup from his shirt. Her hand lingering a second too long against his chest, Julian caught her gaze, something tightening low in his chest. But Marisol, cheeks flushing, quickly stepped back. "Come on," she said, tossing him a clean cloth. "Let's finish before you flood the place." Julian grinned, catching it easily, and fell into step beside her, his heart beating faster than it should have. They found a tiny cafe tucked just off the beach, a few plastic tables scattered beneath a faded awning. The ocean glittered beyond, the air thick with the scent of salt and roasting coffee beans. Marisol ordered 2 coffees and slid into a seat across from him, her bare feet digging absently into the sand. For a moment, they sat in silence, the sound of the surf filling the spaces where words failed. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice low. "I'm not sure this life I'm supposed to go back to is the one I want anymore," he admitted. "Everything feels wrong. Like I've been walking a path someone else chose for me." Marisol watched him carefully, her fingers curled around her coffee cup. "You don't seem like the type to doubt himself," she said. Julian let out a short, humorless laugh. "Maybe I'm just good at pretending." Marisol tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I used to think you were like the others," she said. "Entitled, arrogant, untouchable." She smiled, then small, genuine, unexpected. "But now, I'm not so sure." Julian held her gaze, feeling something shift inside him, something fragile, terrifying, and completely real. "I don't want to leave," he said quietly. "Not without knowing if there's something worth staying for." Marisol didn't answer right away, but she didn't look away either, and in the heavy, sun-soaked silence between them, something delicate and dangerous took root, something neither of them could name yet, but both could feel. Outside the cafe, Marisol unchained an old Vespa parked against a faded wall, the blue paint chipped and sun-bleached. She swung one leg over the seat with easy grace, fitting the key into the ignition. Julian hesitated a beat before stepping closer. "You're not expecting me to jog back, are you?" he asked, a crooked smile tugging at his mouth. Marisol laughed, tossing a quick glance over her shoulder. "Hop on, city boy. Just try not to fall off." He slid onto the seat behind her, careful with his still tender ankle, and instinctively wrapped his arms around her waist for balance. The Vespa sputtered to life, and they pulled away from the curb, weaving through the narrow village streets. The wind whipped through his hair, warm and heavy with salt, and Julian tightened his grip slightly, feeling the solid strength of her beneath his hands. She smelled like the ocean, clean, wild, untamed. He leaned in closer without thinking, his mouth brushing the curve of her shoulder, light as a breath. Marisol stiffened for half a heartbeat, then relaxed, her hand tightening slightly on the handlebars but making no move to pull away. Encouraged, Julian pressed a kiss to the spot where her neck met her shoulder, tasting salt and sun and something purely hers. Marisol let out a breath that was almost a sigh, tilting her head just enough to give him room. Neither of them spoke. The Vespa roared over the coastal road, the ocean stretching endless and glittering to one side. But Julian barely noticed. All he could feel was the steady beat of her heart under his palm, the softness of her skin against his lips. The unbearable pull of something he could no longer pretend wasn't real. By the time they reached the resort's gates, Julian knew he was already too far gone to turn back. They pulled up in front of the resort just as the late afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting everything in a rich golden haze. Marisol killed the engine, hopping off the Vespa with effortless grace. Before Julian could say anything, a staff member hurried over, calling her name, Marisol. "You're needed backstage. The final run-through is starting." She gave Julian a small, apologetic smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Julian nodded, reluctant to let her slip away but understanding all the same. "I'll see you after," he said quietly, Marisol hesitated for a heartbeat, just long enough for something unsaid to pass between them, then turned and jogged toward the cluster of staff gathering by the main stage. Julian watched her until she disappeared into the crowd, a hollow ache settling low in his chest. He turned and made his way back toward the poolside bar, where he knew his friends would be, and sure enough, he spotted them sprawled across a set of lounge chairs, sunglasses crooked, drinks sweating in their hands. As he approached, Derek spotted him first, waving a half-empty beer bottle in the air. "Look who decided to join us," he crowed, his voice already slurring at the edges. "Or did you finally get bored playing Tarzan with your island girl?" Laughter erupted from the group, careless and loud. Julian didn't even flinch. He stepped up to their table, casting a long shadow across the tiles, and said in a voice low enough to slice through the noise, "I'm not leaving with you." The laughter sputtered, confusion rippling through them. "What the hell are you talking about?" Derek said, sitting up straighter. Julian looked at them, really looked, and for the first time, they all seemed so small, a group of boys clinging to a world he was already halfway out of. It was Marcus who broke the quiet, swinging his legs off the lounge chair and standing up. "You serious?" he asked, his voice low, searching. Julian nodded once, sharp and sure. Marcus scrubbed a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. "Man, whatever you decide, it's your life. Just make damn sure you're not blowing it up over a fantasy." Marcus's voice steady but rougher now. He stepped in a little closer, lowering his voice so only Julian could hear. "And make sure you're not confusing lust with love, all right? This is you, Julian. I've known you since you were 12. You've never been the guy who falls in love." Julian held his gaze, something twisting deep inside him, not anger, not even defensiveness, just the cold, stunning realization that maybe, this time, he finally had. The beach had been transformed into a stage, the sand smoothed into a wide circle, surrounded by flickering torches. A low drumbeat thrummed through the heavy night air, steady and primal, as the crowd gathered in a wide arc around the performance space. Julian stood near the back, a drink forgotten in his hand, his gaze locked on the figures assembling at the edge of the firelight, and then he saw her. Marisol stepped forward with the other dancers, barefoot, her body draped in a costume of flowing fabric and intricate beadwork that shimmered with every movement. Her hair was loose, wild around her shoulders, catching the firelight in dark, molten waves. Strands of delicate shells and feathers wove through it, whispering with each breath of wind. The dance was called Love and War, and it was no polite tourist show. It was fierce, raw, and breathtaking, a story told in the arch of her back, the flex of her arms, the way her hips rolled in defiance and invitation all at once. It was desire and battle intertwined, the endless push and pull between surrender and pride, passion and resistance. Marisol's body wove through the music like flame through dry grass, beautiful, wild, unstoppable, and more than once, as she spun and dipped and rose, her eyes found Julian's in the crowd, lingering just a second longer than necessary before flicking away, leaving him gutted and breathless. The others around him cheered and whistled, some laughing, some shouting crude remarks, but Julian barely heard them. All he could see was her. She wasn't just dancing. She was revealing something elemental, something that had nothing to do with resorts or tourists or casual flings. This was who she was, untamed, proud, utterly alive. He realized in that moment, with a clarity that left him reeling, that he wasn't just attracted to her. He was lost, hopelessly, helplessly lost. By the time the music reached its fevered crescendo, Julian's heart was pounding in time with the drums, his hands clenched uselessly at his sides, a hollow ache blooming in his chest. And when the dance ended, when Marisol and her dancers froze in their final pose, breathless and radiant, it took everything he had not to push through the crowd and go to her right then and there. Instead, He stood frozen, the cheers rising around him, his whole body taut with the effort of restraint. Because he knew without doubt, without excuse, that he couldn't stay away much longer, and that whatever came next, he wouldn't be able to stop it even if he tried. The bungalow was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from scattered candles placed along the windowsills and the edge of a large sunken jacuzzi. The air was thick with the scent of salt, warm water, and something faintly floral, a soft, heady blend that clung to the humidity. Marisol reclined in the steaming pool, her body half submerged beneath the rippling surface, her eyes closed, her skin glowing gold under the flickering candlelight. The water lapped gently at her shoulders, strands of her dark hair fanning around her like silk. She didn't hear the door open. Julian stood in the threshold for a heartbeat, just breathing her in, the soft light, the stillness, the raw beauty of her, stripped of every pretense. It hit him like a punch to the chest. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate, as if afraid that any sound might break the fragile spell wrapping the room. The faint creak of the floorboards. Marisol's eyes snapped open. For a moment, confusion clouded her face, then shock. A flash of something close to panic as she reached instinctively for a towel draped across the side of the tub. Julian moved faster, closing the distance into strides. "Don't," he whispered slowly, his voice low, rough around the edges. "Marisol, don't hide from me." Marisol froze, the towel slipping from her fingers. The water rippled between them, thick with the tension that spun out in the tight space, shimmering in the candlelight. Julian knelt by the edge of the tub, his hands braced on the cool tile, his gaze locked onto hers. "I had to come," he said, his voice rough with need. I can't think about anything but you." Marisol swallowed hard, her breathing shallow. The space between them crackled, electric, unbearable. Slowly giving her time to pull away if she wanted, Julian reached out, his fingers brushing lightly along the side of her face, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her cheekbone. Marisol didn't move, didn't look away, didn't stop him. Something in her eyes, defiance, longing. Surrender shattered the last thread of restraint inside him. In one fluid motion, Julian leaned in, his mouth capturing hers with a hunger that had been building for days, maybe longer. Marisol gasped against his lips, her hands rising to his shoulders. Clutching at him, as if anchoring herself against a tide too strong to fight, he slid into the water without thinking. Clothes and all the heat of the pool, nothing compared to the heat of her body pressing against his. Their kiss deepened, desperate and searching, years of loneliness and longing burning away in a single breathless moment. Hands roamed frantic, reverent, mapping skin and bone, every touch leaving a trail of fire in its wake. Julian pulled her closer, feeling her heart hammering against his chest, feeling the small, broken sound she made when he kissed the corner of her mouth, the hollow of her throat, the curve of her shoulder. Marisol whispered his name. Not a protest, not a warning, but a need, a permission, a surrender. They came together in a tangle of heat and breath, nothing careful, nothing controlled, just raw need, pure and consuming. In that moment, there was no past, no future, only the desperate, aching certainty that they had found something too rare to ever let slip away. The first light of dawn spilled through the slatted shutters, casting soft golden stripes across the rumpled sheets. Julian stirred, blinking against the haze of sleep, his body deliciously heavy, sore in ways he hadn't felt in years. And there she was, curled against him, her head resting on his shoulder, one leg tangled lazily over his. The slow rise and fall of her breath warmed his skin, and for a long moment he just lay there, drinking it in, afraid that moving might somehow shatter the fragile peace wrapped around them. Marisol shifted slightly, murmuring something he couldn't catch, her fingers trailing idly across his chest as she woke. He smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Good morning," he whispered. She opened her eyes, the blue-green of them still blurred with sleep, and gave him a small, crooked smile that made something deep inside him clench. "I have to go," she said reluctantly, her voice husky. "The resort's diving trip leaves in an hour." Julian made a low sound of protest, tightening his arm around her. "Stay," he murmured, nuzzling the curve of her neck. Marisol laughed softly, regretful but firm, pulling herself free with a lingering kiss to his jaw. "If I don't show up, they'll send a search party," she teased. Julian watched her dress quickly, moving through the candlelit room with practiced efficiency. He sat up, the sheet pooling around his waist, unable to stop smiling as he watched her slip into a simple sundress and knot her damp hair at the nape of her neck. At the door, she paused, glancing back. "You'll still be here when I get back?" she asked, almost lightly, but something uncertain flickered in her eyes. Julian swung his legs over the bed, standing barefoot on the cool tile. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice rough with truth. She gave him one last smile, shy and bright and achingly real, before slipping out the door, leaving the scent of salt and something sweeter lingering in her wake. Julian stood there for a moment, dazed and full to the brim with something he wasn't ready to name. Then he grabbed his shorts, threw on a shirt, and headed downstairs, whistling under his breath, already planning how he would extend his stay. The marina bustled with the usual morning chaos, dive teams loading gear, tourists chattering excitedly, the sharp scent of salt and diesel hanging in the air. Marisol moved through it all with practiced ease, her wetsuit unzipped halfway, a towel slung over one shoulder, her mind already shifting into work mode. She barely noticed the two resort workers chatting near the equipment shed until she heard her name, floating carelessly through the humid air. "Did you see that guy Marisol's been hanging around with?" one of them said, laughing. "The one from the loud bachelor party? Turns out he's getting married in a few weeks. Big society wedding, they say." Marisol stopped mid-step, the words hitting her like a slap. For a moment, she just stood there, the world narrowing around her, the noises of the dock dimming into a low, indistinct roar. Bachelor party, marriage, a few weeks. She forced herself to move, to breathe, to keep walking past them without so much as a flinch, her steps steady, even as her chest twisted painfully inside. She didn't go back to the resort. She didn't call him, didn't storm into his room demanding answers. She had too much pride for that, too much self-respect to beg for truths that should have been freely given. Instead, she stripped off her wetsuit with mechanical precision, changed into her clothes, and headed straight for the small ferry that would take her across the island to the only place she knew she could breathe, home. The ride was rough, the boat tossing on the waves, but Marisol barely felt it. All she could think about was how easily she had let herself believe, how easily she had let him slip past her defenses, how stupid she had been to think, even for a second, that she could be different, that she could matter to someone like him. Marisol knew she could never trust a man who would betray his future wife. Just weeks before their wedding, by the time she stepped onto the weathered dock near her family's modest home, the anger had settled deep into her bones. Heavy and bitter, not just anger at Julian. She was angry at herself because she had known better, and still she had let herself hope. Julian spent the morning in a haze of restless anticipation, wandering between the resort's shaded terraces and the beach, his eyes flicking constantly toward the marina. Any moment now, he told himself, any second, he would see her stepping off the dive boat, sun-kissed and smiling, slipping effortlessly back into his arms. But noon came and went, and the boats returned without her. By mid-afternoon, a knot of unease had formed in his gut, tight and unyielding. He asked around casually at first, forcing a lightness he didn't feel, but no one seemed to know where she had gone. By sunset, he wasn't pretending anymore. He checked the bungalow. Empty. He checked the staff quarters. Nothing. Finally, desperate, he went to the front desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. Marisol Reyes, he said to the concierge, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need her phone number. It's urgent." The woman hesitated, casting a wary glance around, but something in Julian's face must have convinced her. With a reluctant nod, she scribbled a number on a scrap of paper and slid it across the counter. Julian ducked into a quiet corner of the lobby and dialed immediately, pressing the phone hard to his ear. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, she picked up. "Marisol," he breathed, relief crashing through him. "Where are you? I've been going crazy all day. I miss you. I can't wait to see you. Please, just tell me where you are." For a moment, there was only silence on the other end, a terrible, heavy silence. Then her voice came, cool and composed, slicing through him like a blade. "Don't call me again, Julian. I don't want to see you again." His chest tightened, a hollow ache blooming where certainty had lived just hours before. "You taught me something important," she continued, her tone devastatingly calm. "You reminded me what kind of men not to trust." Julian opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but she was already finishing, her words final and absolute. "I won't be coming back to the resort. Not for the next 3 days. Not ever for you." And then the line went dead. Julian stared at the phone, the dial tone buzzing in his ear, the lobby spinning around him. He had no idea what had happened and no idea what he had done. All he knew was that she was gone, and he had no idea how to bring her back. Julian didn't think. He moved back at the front desk. He leaned in close, his voice low, his hand slipping a thick wad of bills across the counter with a quiet urgency. "I need to know where she lives," he said, his gaze sharp, unrelenting. "Please." The clerk hesitated only a second before scribbling down an address, glancing nervously around before sliding it into Julian's waiting hand. Within minutes, Julian flagged down a tuk-tuk, rattling down the dusty coastal roads under the deepening night. The lights of the resort faded behind him, swallowed by the thick jungle and the endless open sky. The ride was a blur, the heavy scent of salt, the rhythmic thrum of the engine, the burning knot of desperation twisting tighter in his gut. Finally, the driver pulled up in front of a small, weathered house perched near the edge of the cliffs. A single light burned in the window. Julian climbed out, heart pounding, and made his way up the uneven path. He hesitated only a moment at the door before knocking. 3 sharp raps against the worn wood. The seconds stretched painfully thin. Then the door creaked open and a tall man with broad shoulders and weathered skin peered out at him, eyebrows knitting together in quiet suspicion. Julian straightened, trying to steady the storm raging inside him. "Good evening," he managed. I'm looking for Marisol." The man studied him for a long, waited moment, then nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "You must be the one," he said quietly. "She's not ready to talk. Give her time, if what you feel is real." "You'll wait." Before Julian could answer, a shadow appeared behind the man. Marisol, standing barefoot in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes shadowed and unreadable. Julian took a step closer, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs, but Marisol didn't move, her body tense, her face closed off in a way that made him falter. "Marisol," he said, his voice rough, almost breaking. "Please just let me explain." For a moment, she said nothing, only tightened her arms around herself as if warding off a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You lied to me," she said finally, her voice low but cutting. "You let me believe there could be something real, when all along I was just part of your bachelor party adventures." Julian shook his head sharply, stepping closer still. "It's not like that. I swear. I didn't plan any of this. I didn't even know I could feel this way until I met you." She let out a soft, bitter laugh, a sound that hurt more than any slap could have. "You're getting married, Julian," she said. 3 weeks from now. To someone else, "I'm not the kind of woman you use to find yourself," she said, each word striking like a lash. "I deserve better. I deserve someone who knows what he wants without having to break hearts along the way." Julian's hands clenched at his sides, aching to reach for her, but he didn't. "I love you," he said hoarsely. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, but it did. And it's real. Marisol, it's the only real thing I've ever felt. I won't marry her. I can't. I am in love with you." Marisol flinched as if the words physically struck her, and that was when Matteo appeared, stepping out of the shadows with a thunderous expression. Before Julian could react, Matteo's fist connected with his jaw in a sharp, brutal arc, sending him stumbling back against the railing. "Stay away from her," Matteo growled, standing protectively between them. Julian wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, his chest heaving, his heart breaking open in the raw night air, but he didn't lash out, didn't fight back. He just looked at Marisol one last time, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale and resolute, and spoke the only truth he had left. Then he turned and walked away. The last thing he saw before the night swallowed him whole was the silent trail of tears slipping down Marisol's cheeks, her body rigid with pride even as her heart betrayed her, the scent of salt and regret hanging thick in the air between them. The boat rocked gently against the dock as Julian and his friends boarded, a day earlier than planned. The sky overhead a muted gray that seemed to mirror the weight settling in his chest. Derek clapped him on the back with an easy grin, while Marcus offered a nod of approval, both throwing around hollow reassurances that he had made the smart choice, that once he returned to his polished life and Eliza's world, the island girl would fade into a distant, foolish memory. Julian said nothing, only stared out over the receding shoreline, the palm trees bending in the breeze, the cliffs shrinking against the horizon. He wasn't the same man who had stepped off the yacht days ago, cocky and restless. Something had shifted, deep and irrevocable, and no amount of cities or boardrooms or careful futures could erase it. As the island blurred into mist, Julian made himself a silent vow he would find a way back to her, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost. 3 months had passed, though some days it felt like a lifetime and others like the blink of an eye. Marisol buried herself in work, mornings on the dive boats, afternoons with the children at the center, evenings preparing for the resort's cultural performances. Her body moved through the motions with familiar ease, but her heart still stumbled over the spaces where he used to be. She told herself she was better off, that she had seen through him in time, that missing him was just a foolish reflex, like missing the idea of something rather than the thing itself. Anger, she had learned, was easier to live with than longing. There were nights, though quiet, aching nights when she would sit alone in her bungalow, the ocean whispering beyond her window, and wonder how it was possible to miss someone she had known for only a breath of her life. And yet, who had left a mark so deep, it felt carved into her bones. She hated herself for it. She hated him for making her feel it. Somewhere across the ocean, she told herself, Julian Hargrove had probably returned to his polished world, his expensive suits and sterile boardrooms, happily married, and had long since forgotten the girl who had been foolish enough to believe she was different. Across the ocean, in a gleaming tower of glass and steel, Julian Hargrove sat before his father in the office that had once felt like a throne and now felt like a cage. "You're serious about this?" his father asked, his voice low, but edged with something sharper, not anger exactly, but a deep, calculating wariness. Julian met his gaze without hesitation. "I am," he said, "not stepping away, building something new. A division focused on sustainability, conservation, restoring the company's legacy before it's too late. We need it, Father. The world is changing, and if Hargrove Industries doesn't change with it, we'll be left behind." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that felt like a test. Finally, his father leaned back, steepling his fingers, his expression unreadable. "You always did have a way of seeing past the obvious," he said at last, "and I suppose even the fallout from your personal decisions can be managed." Julian stiffened slightly, but didn't flinch. Walking away from Eliza had cost them politically, socially, financially, but sitting here, fighting for a future he actually believed in, Julian knew he would make the same choice again. "I chose the life I want," Julian said, voice steady. "Not one arranged for appearances. Not one traded for alliances." His father studied him a moment longer, then nodded once reluctant. "But real, you're my son," he said. "I trust you know what you're risking, and I can tell. There's more driving you than just business." There was a glint in his father's eyes, a subtle, knowing thing, but he didn't press. He simply rose from behind the desk and offered his hand. The resort throbbed with an expectant energy as the last light of day bled into the horizon, casting the sky in deep indigos and burning golds, while the staff moved swiftly among the guests, hanging lanterns that flickered like fireflies and preparing the open-air stage for the night's performance. Marisol tightened the sash around her hips, steadying her breath as she stood behind the gauzy curtain with the other dancers, telling herself it was just another night, another dance, another way to honor the island's spirit, even if the low, persistent ache inside her said otherwise. When the drums began, their deep, thrumming pulse rising into the heavy air, she stepped onto the sandlit stage, her body finding the rhythm out of instinct more than thought, the familiar movements pulling her forward as the crowd's murmurs fell into a hush. She danced fluid and strong, each sway of her hips and arch of her arms, telling the ancient story of love and war, of losing and surviving, of roots that clung stubbornly to the earth no matter how fierce the storm, and for a time, she let herself forget, losing herself to the music, the warmth of the torches, the pull of the tide in her veins. But when her gaze swept across the gathered faces, searching without meaning to, she caught sight of a figure near the edge of the crowd, tall, broad-shouldered, familiar in a way that made her heart lurch painfully against her ribs. Julian? Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, because when she blinked again, he was gone, swallowed by the shifting bodies and the shadows stretching long across the beach. She stumbled slightly, barely catching herself before her falter could be noticed, and forced herself to finish the dance, bowing deeply alongside the others as polite applause swelled around them, still breathless, still trying to steady the pounding in her chest. She moved off to the side of the stage, just as the resort manager stepped forward, his voice carrying easily across the gathering. "Thank you all for joining us on this special night," he said, smiling broadly. "As you know, our beautiful resort has recently come under new ownership, and it's my honor to introduce the visionary who has promised not only to preserve the soul of this place, but to help it thrive." There was a ripple of curiosity through the crowd as he turned, gesturing grandly toward the shadows. "Please welcome Mr. Julian Hargrove." Marisol's heart slammed into her ribs so hard she thought she might collapse, frozen at the edge of the gathering. She watched as Julian stepped into the soft circle of torchlight, wearing simple linen trousers and a white shirt open at the collar. His presence somehow both familiar and entirely new, steadier, grounded, unshakable in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or status, and everything to do with who he had become. When he spoke, his voice was clear, steady, and achingly real. "When I first came here," Julian said, his gaze finding hers immediately, "I thought I was just running away. From expectations. From a life that wasn't mine, but this island, and the people who breathe life into it, showed me something I didn't know I had been searching for." He paused, the words hanging heavy in the warm air. "They showed me that strength isn't measured by power or money. It's in loyalty, in tradition, in the fierce beauty of protecting something that matters." He smiled, then a small, private smile meant only for her. "This resort will honor that spirit. It will stand for preservation, for community, for hope, because some places are too rare to be replaced, and sometimes if you're lucky. You find someone who reminds you of who you were always meant to be. Marisol stood rooted to the spot, her throat burning, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone around her could hear it. Before the applause could swell again, she turned and fled, slipping through the edges of the crowd, running blind toward the only place that felt remotely safe, her bungalow. The night swallowed her whole as she ran, the soft thud of her bare feet against the worn wooden planks barely audible beneath the roaring in her ears. Lanterns blurred past in streaks of gold and shadow, the humid air thick against her skin, but Marisol didn't slow down until she reached the narrow steps of her bungalow, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the door. She didn't even make it inside before she heard the heavy fall of footsteps behind her. Marisol. Julian's voice called, breathless, cutting through the night like a blade. She turned just as he caught up, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and desperate, and so full of something that stole the breath from her lungs, without thinking, without allowing herself another second of weakness. She slapped him across the face, a sharp, resounding crack that seemed to echo into the stars. Julian didn't move away, didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a strangled laugh, low and hoarse, one hand lifting slowly to cradle the side of his face. "God, Marisol," he rasped, his voice thick with something broken and reverent. "How do you carry wildness and grace inside you like this?" Marisol shook her head, blinking against the sting in her eyes, her voice a whisper of accusation and longing all at once. "Where have you been?" she said, the words barely more than a breath. 3 months, Julian. 3 months of silence. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat rolling off him, his hand hovering near her cheek, but not daring to touch. "I was building a future," he said, his voice fierce and trembling. "One where I could stand beside you, not as the man I was, but the man you deserve. It took 3 months to tear down the life that wasn't mine. But I would have waited a lifetime if it meant finding my way back to you." The words knocked the air from her chest, left her swaying where she stood, and when he finally reached for her, threading his fingers through her hair, pulling her gently toward him, she didn't resist. When their lips met, it was steady and sure, a kiss without doubts or defenses, as if all the distance between them had never existed. It was quiet, certain, and real, a moment of knowing rather than longing, the final step toward something neither of them could deny anymore. When they broke apart, gasping, foreheads pressed together, Julian cupped her face with both hands, his thumb brushing the tears she hadn't even realized were falling. "I love you," he whispered fiercely, as if it were a vow. "I'm not going anywhere, Marisol. Not ever again." And as she wrapped her arms around him, feeling the steady thrum of his heart against her own, Marisol finally let herself believe in second chances, in the wild, impossible beauty of love when it was fought for, bled for, and truly, finally found.